"You don't belong in this neighborhood, boy. Pack up your little shop and get out before I make you disappear." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the warm atmosphere of Common Grounds Coffee. Sheriff Marcus Kane's voice carried the casual venom of a man accustomed to delivering threats without consequences, his pale blue eyes fixed on the black man behind the counter with predatory intensity. David Washington didn't flinch. His hands remained steady on the espresso machine, steam rising from the milk frother, as if the morning routine could somehow shield against the hatred filling his coffee shop. The ceramic cup he'd been preparing sat forgotten on the counter, the perfect cappuccino art dissolving into meaningless swirls. The confrontation had erupted without warning. One moment, David had been serving Mrs. Henderson her usual extra cinnamon cappuccino, chatting with Jake Morrison about his construction project, watching Sarah Chen grab her post-shift coffee before heading home. The next, Sheriff Kane had slammed through the front door like a storm cloud, his imposing 6'2" frame casting shadows across the sun-dappled hardwood floors. Kane's tan uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, the silver badge on his chest catching the morning light and throwing off reflections that seemed to cut through the carefully cultivated warmth David had worked so hard to create. His duty belt creaked with the weight of authority. Handcuffs, radio, service weapon, all the tools of power that Kane wielded like extensions of his own malice. Without a word, Kane stormed behind the counter and grabbed David by the collar, yanking him forward with a violent jerk that sent the milk pitcher clattering to the floor. The entire shop froze. David's feet stumbled briefly as Kane shook him once, twice, like a man trying to rattle defiance loose by force. "Sheriff," David managed, his voice tight but composed despite the assault. "I'm a legitimate business owner with current permits and licenses. If you have specific concerns about compliance, you can file them through proper channels." Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless, a sound that made Mrs. Henderson visibly recoil in her corner booth. "Compliance?" He leaned forward, still gripping David's shirt, their faces only inches apart. "Boy, this isn't about paperwork. This is about you understanding your place." The racist slur hit like a physical blow, delivered with such casual cruelty that Jake Morrison's hands clenched into fists at his table. Sarah Chen moved instinctively closer to Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian's face pale with shock and growing anger. The comfortable morning routine had been shattered, replaced by something ugly and dangerous that none of them had expected to witness in their peaceful coffee shop. "I know exactly what this is about," David said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of steel that made Kane's eyes narrow with suspicion. "And I'm not going anywhere." The sheriff's face flushed red, veins standing out on his thick neck, as David's calm refusal to be intimidated clearly frustrated him. Kane was used to fear, accustomed to immediate compliance when he applied pressure. David's steady resistance was throwing off his entire playbook, making him reach for more aggressive tactics. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Kane snarled, his grip tightening on David's shirt before finally shoving him back toward the counter. "I've been keeping this county safe for 15 years. I know every judge, every prosecutor, every city council member. You think your fancy coffee and your uppity attitude are going to protect you?" David steadied himself, standing tall as he adjusted his collar and met Kane's gaze without flinching. Inside, his analytical mind was cataloging every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that crossed Kane's face. This wasn't random harassment. This was systematic intimidation designed to drive him out of business and out of town. Mrs. Henderson stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with harsh finality. Despite her small frame, she somehow radiated the moral authority of someone who had lived through too much history to remain silent in the face of injustice. "Sheriff Kane," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had spent 40 years commanding classroom attention. "David is a valued member of this community. Your behavior is completely inappropriate." Kane's head swiveled toward her with predatory focus, his eyes narrowing as he processed this unexpected challenge to his authority. "Mrs. Henderson, isn't it? The librarian?" His voice carried a mocking edge. "Maybe you should stick to your books and let the men handle real-world problems." The dismissive sexism layered on top of the racial harassment created a toxic atmosphere that made the coffee shop feel suddenly claustrophobic. Jake Morrison stood up from his table, his construction workers framed tense with barely controlled anger. The community David had worked so hard to build was rallying around him, but their support only seemed to increase Kane's fury. "Everyone needs to mind their own business," Kane said, his voice carrying clear warning as he glanced around the room. "Unless they want their businesses inspected for code violations, their taxes audited, their parking tickets reviewed for irregularities." The threats were unveiled now, no longer hidden behind official language or professional courtesy. Kane was using his badge as a weapon, wielding the power of his office to silence opposition and protect his ability to continue his harassment. David stepped forward slightly, drawing Kane's attention back to him and away from the customers who had shown such courage. "Sheriff, I think this conversation has gone far enough. If you have legitimate business concerns, you can file them through proper channels. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my establishment." Kane's eyes widened with shock and rage at being dismissed by a black man in front of white witnesses. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, a gesture that made everyone in the coffee shop tense with fear. For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge, the potential for violence crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "I'm giving you 1 week," Kane said finally, his voice carrying the promise of future harassment and escalation. 7 days to close up shop and disappear. After that, things get complicated. Health inspections, fire code violations, business license reviews. There are so many ways a business can fail to meet county standards. David looked directly into Kane's eyes, his expression unchanging, despite the threat that would have sent most people scrambling for safety. "Sheriff, I'm not going anywhere. This is my business, my investment, and my future." Kane's face contorted with rage at David's continued defiance. He straightened up, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the counter. "This isn't over, boy. Not by a long shot. You've made a big mistake. A mistake that's going to cost you everything." He turned on his heel with military precision, his spurs jingling as he strode toward the door. But before leaving, he paused at Mrs. Henderson's table, looking down at her with obvious disdain. "Be careful about the company you keep, Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes defending the wrong people can have consequences." The door slammed shut behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, and the coffee shop sat in stunned silence for several long moments. The warm, welcoming atmosphere had been poisoned by Kane's presence, leaving behind an emotional residue that would take time to dissipate. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak. Her voice stronger than her trembling hands suggested. "David, I am so sorry you had to experience that. Sheriff Kane's behavior was absolutely unacceptable." Jake nodded vigorously, his face still flushed with anger. "That was pure racism, man. Pure and simple. We all saw it, and we won't forget it." Sarah moved to the counter, her nurse's training making her instinctively check on David's emotional state. "Are you okay? Do you want to call someone? File a report?" David managed a small smile, genuinely touched by their immediate support. "I'm fine, thank you. And thank you all for standing up to him. That took real courage." But even as he accepted their reassurance, David's mind was already working through the implications of what had just occurred. Kane wasn't just a racist sheriff throwing his weight around. He was a systematic abuser of power who had clearly been operating unchecked for years. The casual confidence with which he had made his threats, the smooth way he had attempted to gaslight the witnesses, the implicit understanding that the system would protect him, it all pointed to someone who had done this many times before. The morning had started like any other in the 3 weeks since Common Grounds Coffee had opened its doors. David had arrived at 6 a.m., grinding beans, setting up the espresso machine, arranging pastries from the local bakery. The routine had become precious to him, the quiet moments before customers arrived, the satisfaction of creating something welcoming and beautiful in a space that had sat empty for years. Main Street had been struggling for decades, storefronts standing vacant while the community's economic life moved to strip malls and chain stores on the outskirts of town. David's coffee shop represented more than just a business venture. It was an act of faith in the possibility of renewal, of bringing life back to the heart of the community. He had chosen this location carefully after months of research. The building had good bones, large windows that flooded the interior with natural light, exposed brick walls that gave it character. The previous tenant had been a hardware store that closed when the owner retired, and the space had sat empty for 2 years before David signed the lease. The renovation had taken 4 months, and most of his savings. He had done much of the work himself, sanding floors, painting walls, installing the gleaming espresso machine that had cost more than some people's cars. Every detail had been chosen with care. The reclaimed wood for the counter, the local art featuring diverse faces, the comfortable seating areas that encouraged conversation and community. In the 3 weeks since opening, David had begun to believe his vision was working. The morning regulars were developing. Mrs. Henderson with her extra cinnamon cappuccino, Jake Morrison grabbing his large black coffee before the job site, Sarah Chen needing her caffeine fix after night shifts at the hospital. They had moved past polite customer service to genuine connection, the kind of relationships that made a business feel like part of the community fabric. But Kane's visit had shattered that illusion of acceptance. The sheriff's casual racism, his confident threats, his assumption that the system would protect him, it all revealed the uglier reality beneath the surface politeness. David realized he had been naive to think that serving good coffee and treating people with respect would be enough to overcome decades of systemic racism and entrenched power structures. As the customers gradually returned to their conversations and the coffee shop slowly regained its normal rhythm, David found himself thinking about the investigation that had brought him to this small county, the federal civil rights violations that had triggered attention from Washington, the pattern of complaints that had been filed and mysteriously dismissed, the businesses that had failed under suspicious circumstances. Sheriff Marcus Kane had just made a critical error. He had revealed himself to exactly the wrong person, demonstrated his methods to someone who understood the system better than Kane could possibly imagine. The sheriff thought he was intimidating a vulnerable small business owner. Instead, he had just provided a detailed confession to someone with the authority and resources to bring his entire corrupt operation crashing down. David continued serving customers and cleaning equipment, maintaining the facade of the hard-working business owner he appeared to be. But beneath the surface, the mind of FBI Civil Rights Division Chief David Washington was already building the case that would end Marcus Kane's reign of terror once and for all. The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Kane had declared war on someone who fought with weapons far more powerful than badges and threats. Someone who fought with the full weight of federal law and the unwavering commitment to justice that had defined his entire career. The morning sun continued streaming through the windows of Common Ground's coffee, but something fundamental had changed. The space was no longer just a coffee shop. It had become ground zero in a fight for civil rights, human dignity, and the soul of a community that would soon be forced to choose between comfortable silence and uncomfortable justice. The coffee shop had returned to its normal rhythm by afternoon, but David's mind remained focused on the morning's confrontation. As he prepared drinks and served customers, he found himself studying each face that walked through the door, wondering how many had witnessed similar scenes before, how many had stayed silent when Sheriff Kane unleashed his particular brand of intimidation. At 2:30 p.m., during the quiet lull between lunch and the after-school rush, David locked the front door and flipped the sign to "Closed for inventory." But instead of counting supplies, he moved to the small office in the back of the building and opened his laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be standard business accounting software. A few keystrokes later, the innocent spreadsheets disappeared, replaced by the encrypted federal database that revealed David Washington's true purpose in this sleepy county. FBI Civil Rights Division Case File CR 2024-0847, Systematic Civil Rights Violations, Madison County Sheriff's Department. The file had been growing for 18 months, fed by complaints from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and individual victims who had found the courage to report their experiences to federal authorities. David scrolled through the documented incidents, each one a small tragedy of American justice perverted by racism and abuse of power. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. but local authorities had consistently dismissed complaints as misunderstandings, miscommunications, or outright fabrications. Marcus Kane's name appeared in 47 separate incident reports. The first documented case dated back 3 years. James Fletcher, a black electrician from Atlanta, had been driving through Madison County when Kane pulled him over for suspicious driving patterns. The traffic stop had lasted 2 hours, during which Kane had demanded to search Fletcher's van, questioned his right to be in the county, and threatened to arrest him for interfering with a police investigation when Fletcher asked why he had been stopped. Fletcher's complaint to the county sheriff's department had been dismissed within a week. Officer Kane followed proper procedure during a routine traffic stop. The official response had stated, "Mr. Fletcher's allegations appear to be based on misunderstanding of standard law enforcement protocols." But Fletcher had been persistent. He contacted the NAACP, filed complaints with the state attorney general's office, and eventually reached federal authorities. His detailed documentation and witness statements had become the foundation for what would eventually become the broader investigation into Madison County's law enforcement practices. David clicked through to the next case. Maria Santos, a Latina business owner who had tried to open a restaurant in the county seat 2 years ago. Kane had visited her establishment 6 times in the first month, each time finding new violations of health codes, fire safety regulations, or business licensing requirements. The constant harassment had driven up her costs and delayed her opening until she finally gave up and moved her business to a neighboring county. Santos's complaint had been more detailed than Fletcher's. She had recorded several of her interactions with Kane, capturing his barely concealed hostility and his creative interpretation of county regulations. The recordings revealed a man who used his badge as a weapon, finding violations where none existed, and creating bureaucratic obstacles designed to drive unwanted businesses out of his territory. Again, the county's response had been dismissive. Officer Kane was conducting routine inspections to ensure public safety. The official statement had read, "Ms. Santos's business faced legitimate compliance issues that she chose not to address." But the recordings told a different story, and federal investigators had found them compelling enough to warrant further investigation. The cases multiplied as David scrolled through the file. Robert Johnson, a black truck driver who had been arrested for resisting arrest after Kane pulled him over for a broken taillight that turned out to be functioning perfectly. Angela Davis, a black teacher who had been detained for suspicious behavior while jogging through a county park. Michael Thompson, a black teenager who had been charged with disturbing the peace for playing music too loudly in his own driveway. Each case followed the same pattern. Kane would target individuals based on race, escalate minor encounters into major confrontations, and then rely on the system to protect him from consequences. Local prosecutors rarely pursued charges against Kane's victims, but they also rarely questioned his methods. The message was clear. If you were black in Madison County, you existed at the mercy of Sheriff Marcus Kane's discretion. But the business cases were the most disturbing. David found documentation of 12 separate incidents over the past 5 years where black entrepreneurs had attempted to establish businesses in Madison County, only to face systematic harassment that drove them away. Kane's methods varied. Unexpected inspections, creative interpretations of zoning laws, sudden discoveries of permit violations, but the result was always the same. Black-owned businesses failed to thrive in Madison County. David opened another encrypted file, this one containing his own investigation notes. For the past 6 months, he had been gathering intelligence on Kane's operation, using resources and methods that went far beyond what local activists could access. Federal surveillance had revealed the scope of Kane's network, the judges who rubber-stamped his arrests, the prosecutors who declined to file charges against his victims, the county commissioners who supported his aggressive policing methods. Kane wasn't operating alone. He was the most visible part of a systemic effort to maintain Madison County as an unwelcoming place for people of color. The investigation had identified at least 12 other officials who were complicit in the pattern of discrimination, creating what federal prosecutors were preparing to argue was a criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights. David's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his partner, Agent Sarah Mitchell, who was coordinating the investigation from the FBI field office 2 counties over. Morning's confrontation went as expected. David typed back. Kane took the bait completely. Full confession on audio, multiple witnesses. The response came back quickly. Outstanding. Legal says we have enough for arrests whenever you're ready. How's your cover holding up? David glanced around the coffee shop, thinking about Mrs. Henderson's fierce defense, Jake Morrison's angry solidarity, Sarah Chen's concerned support. Better than expected. The community is rallying. Might actually keep this place open when the investigation concludes. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had established Common Grounds Coffee as an investigative cover, a way to embed himself in the community and document Kane's harassment patterns firsthand. But somewhere along the way, the coffee shop had become more than just an operation. It had become a genuine investment in the community's future, a demonstration that black businesses could thrive if given a fair chance. David closed the encrypted files and returned to his business accounting software. The afternoon customers would be arriving soon. High school students grabbing drinks before sports practice, office workers seeking their afternoon caffeine fix, retirees meeting for their daily social hour. The rhythm of small-town life that he had grown to appreciate over the past 3 weeks. At 4 p.m., he unlocked the front door and flipped the sign back to open. Within minutes, the familiar faces began arriving. Tommy Martinez, a high school senior who worked part-time at the grocery store, ordered his usual iced coffee with extra vanilla. Betty and Frank Williams, retirees who had become afternoon regulars, settled into their favorite corner table with their crossword puzzle. But David noticed the subtle changes in atmosphere. Conversations were quieter, glances more nervous. Word of the morning's confrontation had spread through the small community, and people were processing the implications. Some seemed more determined to support his business, making a point of ordering extra items or staying longer than usual. Others appeared uncomfortable, as if associating with him might bring unwanted attention from law enforcement. The division was exactly what Kane had intended. By making his harassment so public and aggressive, he had forced the community to choose sides. Those who supported David would be marked as troublemakers, potentially subject to the same harassment that had driven away previous black business owners. Those who distanced themselves would be rewarded with Kane's approval and protection. At 4:30, Mrs. Henderson returned for her afternoon tea, something she had never done before. She approached the counter with the determined expression of someone who had made an important decision. "David, I've been thinking about this morning," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "Sheriff Kane's behavior was completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that you have more support in this community than you might realize." David nodded gratefully, touched by her courage in returning so soon after Kane's threats. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Henderson. This morning was intense." "It was illegal," she said firmly. "What Kane did was racial harassment, pure and simple. And it's not the first time." David's attention sharpened. This was the opening he had been hoping for. A chance to learn about Kane's history from someone who had observed his methods over time. "You've seen him do this before?" Mrs. Henderson glanced around the coffee shop, ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard. 3 years ago, there was a young man named Marcus Williams who tried to open an auto repair shop on the east side of town. Beautiful facility, state-of-the-art equipment, everything up to code. Kane visited that shop at least once a week, always finding some new violation, some new problem that needed to be addressed. She paused, her expression growing sad. Marcus was a good man, a veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had saved for years to open that business, and he was doing everything right. But Kane made his life so difficult that he finally gave up and moved to another county. The building is still empty. David felt the familiar anger that came with hearing about injustice, but he kept his expression neutral and encouraging. "Did Marcus ever file complaints?" "He tried," Mrs. Henderson said, "but Kane was careful. He never said anything overtly racist, never left clear evidence of bias. It was all done through official channels, using county regulations as weapons. By the time Marcus realized what was happening, his savings were exhausted and his credit was ruined." The pattern was exactly what David had seen in the federal files. Kane was sophisticated in his methods, using the bureaucratic machinery of local government to achieve racist ends while maintaining plausible deniability. It made him more dangerous than crude bigots who revealed their hatred openly. There was also a family named the Johnsons who tried to buy a house in the Maple Street neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson continued. They had approved financing, excellent credit, everything was in order. But somehow their property inspection revealed foundation problems that 3 previous inspections had missed. When they hired their own inspector, he found no issues at all. The deal fell through, and they ended up buying in another county. David mentally added the Johnsons to his growing list of Cain's victims. Housing discrimination was another federal crime, and if he could document a pattern of manipulated inspections, it would strengthen the case significantly. Mrs. Henderson, David said carefully, do you think there are other people in the community who would be willing to talk about their experiences with Sheriff Cain? People who might have witnessed things or been affected by his methods? She considered the question seriously, her librarian's mind cataloging the possibilities. There's Robert Patterson, who owns the hardware store. He's mentioned concerns about Cain's enforcement methods, and Pastor Williams at the Baptist Church has spoken privately about the need for more accountability in law enforcement. They're good people, but they're also careful. Cain has made it clear that public criticism comes with consequences. The fear in her voice was palpable, and David realized how much courage it had taken for her to return to the coffee shop so soon after Cain's threats. She was risking her own safety to support his business and challenge the sheriff's authority. I want you to know, David said quietly, that your support means everything to me. It takes real courage to stand up to someone like Cain, and you've shown incredible bravery today. Mrs. Henderson smiled, but her expression remained serious. David, I lived through the civil rights movement. I watched this country struggle to live up to its founding principles, and I've seen the progress we've made. But I've also seen how easily that progress can be reversed if good people stay silent in the face of injustice. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Sheriff Cain represents everything we thought we had left behind. He's using his badge to enforce a racial hierarchy that has no place in modern America. If we don't stand up to him now, we're complicit in perpetuating a system that denies equal justice to all citizens. David felt a surge of respect for the elderly librarian. Her analysis was sophisticated, and her moral clarity was inspiring. She understood exactly what was at stake, not just for his business, but for the community's soul. As the afternoon wore on, other customers shared similar stories. Jake Morrison mentioned a black construction crew that had been repeatedly harassed while working on a county project until they finally walked off the job. Sarah Chen described a black nurse who had been hired at the hospital but left after facing constant scrutiny from Cain during her commute to work. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of Cain's systematic harassment campaign. The sheriff wasn't just targeting individuals. He was working to maintain Madison County as a space where black residents and business owners felt unwelcome and unsafe. It was a calculated effort to preserve racial segregation through the abuse of law enforcement authority. By closing time, David had gathered enough new information to significantly expand his federal case file. But more importantly, he had gained a deeper understanding of the community he was fighting to protect. These weren't just statistics in a civil rights investigation. They were neighbors, friends, and supporters who deserved to live free from harassment and intimidation. As he locked up the coffee shop and headed to his temporary apartment, David reflected on the day's events. Cain's morning confrontation had been exactly the kind of evidence federal prosecutors needed to demonstrate the sheriff's methods and motivations. But the afternoon's conversations had revealed something equally important, a community ready to stand up for justice if given the leadership and support they needed. The investigation was entering its final phase, and Cain had no idea that his reign of terror was about to end. But ending Cain's personal campaign of harassment was only the beginning. The real work would be rebuilding trust, healing community divisions, and ensuring that Madison County became a place where all citizens could thrive, regardless of race. David Washington, FBI Civil Rights Division Chief, was ready for both challenges. The badge hidden in his apartment would soon replace the coffee shop apron, but his commitment to this community would remain long after Sheriff Marcus Cain was just another reminder of how quickly justice could triumph over injustice when good people found the courage to act. That evening, David Washington sat in his sparsely furnished apartment above the antique shop on Elm Street, staring at 3 monitors that displayed a very different reality than the cozy coffee shop downstairs. The modest rental had been chosen for its strategic location, clear sightlines to the sheriff's department, the courthouse, and the county commissioner's office, and its unremarkable appearance that wouldn't attract attention from Kane's network. At exactly 9 p.m., his encrypted phone chimed with an incoming secure video call. The screen flickered to life, revealing the familiar face of Agent Sarah Mitchell, his partner and the case coordinator for Operation Clean Sweep, the federal investigation into civil rights violations in Madison County. "David," Sarah's voice came through crystal clear despite the multiple layers of encryption. "I've been monitoring the local police scanners all day. Kane's been busy since your confrontation this morning." David leaned back in his chair, coffee growing cold in the cup beside his keyboard. How busy? He made 6 traffic stops between noon and 6 p.m., all targeting vehicles with black drivers. 3 were from out of county, just passing through. No citations issued, but each stop lasted over 30 minutes. Classic intimidation pattern. Sarah's face was illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors in the FBI field office. Her auburn hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she favored during long investigation days. She had been David's partner for 4 years, working civil rights cases across the South, and she understood the psychology of systemic racism better than most federal agents. "Any backup units called?" David asked, knowing that Kane often used the presence of multiple officers to escalate psychological pressure during routine stops. 2 of the stops involved backup. In both cases, the secondary officers were Deputies Mitchell and Torres, both on our surveillance list for potential civil rights violations. The pattern suggests coordinated harassment rather than individual bad behavior. David nodded grimly. The federal investigation had identified a network of at least 8 deputies who regularly participated in Kane's harassment campaigns. It wasn't just one corrupt sheriff. It was an institutional culture of racism and abuse that permeated the entire department. "What about electronic surveillance?" David asked. "Are we picking up anything useful from the wiretaps?" Sarah consulted her notes, scrolling through intercepted communications that had been authorized under the federal investigation. "Kane made 3 phone calls to County Commissioner Bradley after your confrontation. The conversations were coded, but the pattern suggests he's concerned about federal attention. He used phrases like outside agitators and protecting community standards, the same language he's used before when coordinating harassment campaigns." David felt a surge of satisfaction. Commissioner Bradley had been identified early in the investigation as Kane's primary political ally, the man who provided cover for the sheriff's activities and ensured that complaints never received serious investigation. Having documented communications between them would strengthen the conspiracy charges that federal prosecutors were preparing. "Any response from Bradley?" David asked. "Interesting development there," Sarah said, her expression growing more serious. "Bradley reached out to Judge Harrison immediately after Kane's call. They're planning a meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. before the courthouse opens. We have surveillance assets in position to document the meeting." Judge Harrison was another key figure in the conspiracy. He had presided over dozens of Kane's arrests, consistently ruling in favor of law enforcement even when evidence of misconduct was overwhelming. The federal investigation had documented a pattern of judicial bias that went far beyond normal deference to police testimony. The surveillance team also intercepted communications between Kane and his wife, Sarah continued. She's been making phone calls to other deputies' families, organizing what she called a support network for when outside forces try to destroy our community. It appears they're preparing for some kind of federal intervention, though they don't know the specifics yet. David found it grimly amusing that Kane's paranoia about federal investigation was entirely justified, though the sheriff had no idea how close the noose was tightening around his operation. The FBI had been documenting his activities for 18 months, building an airtight case that would dismantle the entire network of corruption. "How's our technical surveillance holding up?" David asked. "Any indication they suspect electronic monitoring?" Nothing so far, Sarah replied. Kane's old school. He trusts in-person meetings and phone calls more than digital communication. It's actually made our job easier. The wiretaps have captured extensive evidence of coordination between multiple officials. The technical surveillance had been crucial to the investigation's success. Federal agents had obtained court orders to monitor communications for 12 county officials suspected of civil rights violations. The intercepted conversations had revealed the scope of the conspiracy and provided evidence of intent that would be crucial for successful prosecution. Sarah, I need you to run background checks on 3 community members who approached me today, David said, pulling up his notes from the afternoon's conversations. Mrs. Helen Henderson, retired librarian. Jake Morrison, construction worker. Robert Patterson, hardware store owner. They're potential witnesses, and I want to make sure they're protected when this goes public. Sarah nodded, typing notes as David spoke. Any security concerns? Has Kane made direct threats against community members who support you? He threatened Mrs. Henderson directly this morning, in front of multiple witnesses. She came back this afternoon to offer more support, which shows incredible courage, but also puts her at risk. I want surveillance assets, monitoring her residence, and daily routine. Consider it done, Sarah said. The witness protection team is already on standby. Once we move to the arrest phase, we'll have protective details for anyone who testified against Kane's network. David felt some relief knowing that the federal government would protect the civilians who had shown such courage in supporting his investigation. Mrs. Henderson, Jake Morrison, and others had risked their own safety to challenge Kane's authority, and they deserved federal protection from retaliation. What's the timeline looking like for arrests? David asked. Kane's escalating his behavior, and I'm concerned about community safety if we wait too long. Sarah consulted another set of files, reviewing the prosecution timeline that had been coordinated between multiple federal agencies. The U.S. Attorney's Office says they'll have indictments ready within 2 weeks. We're coordinating with the Marshal's Service for simultaneous arrests to prevent evidence destruction and flight risk. Simultaneous arrests for how many targets? 17 total. Kane and 7 deputies, Judge Harrison, Commissioner Bradley, County Attorney Morrison, and 5 other officials who've been documented as part of the conspiracy. The operation will require coordination between the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and federal prosecutors from 3 different districts. David whistled softly. 17 arrests would effectively decapitate the entire power structure that had enabled Kane's reign of terror. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive response that civil rights violations demanded, not just individual accountability, but systemic reform. Any concerns about local law enforcement resistance? David asked. Kane's people are armed and have shown willingness to use violence. The Marshal's Service is treating this as a high-risk operation, Sarah replied. They're bringing tactical teams from Atlanta and Birmingham to ensure overwhelming force advantage. The arrests will happen simultaneously at 6 a.m. to minimize coordination between targets. The tactical planning was crucial because Kane's network included armed law enforcement officers who might resist arrest if they had advance warning. Federal marshals specialized in arresting corrupt cops, and they understood the unique challenges of taking down officers who were accustomed to being on the other side of handcuffs. What about media strategy? David asked. This is going to be a major story, and we need to control the narrative to protect community healing. Sarah pulled up another file, this one containing the public affairs strategy that had been developed by the FBI's media relations team. Full press conference, the day of arrests, with participation from FBI Director, U.S. Attorney, and Civil Rights Division leadership. We're emphasizing the systematic nature of the violations and the federal government's commitment to protecting civil rights. Community outreach component. Town hall meetings, scheduled for the week after arrests, facilitated by Civil Rights Division community liaisons. The goal is to rebuild trust and establish new oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. David felt satisfied with the comprehensive approach. Ending Kane's personal reign of terror was important, but the real success would be measured by long-term community healing and institutional reform. The federal government's response needed to demonstrate that civil rights violations would not be tolerated while also providing support for positive change. "One more thing," Sarah said, her expression growing more serious. "We've been monitoring social media and online communications for threats against you personally. So far, it's mostly local chatter, but there are some concerning posts on white supremacist forums about defending Madison County from outside agitators." David felt a chill of concern. While he was trained and armed as a federal agent, his cover identity as a coffee shop owner made him vulnerable to attack from Kane's supporters who might not know his true identity. The investigation had attracted attention from extremist groups who saw it as part of a broader federal assault on white communities. "What's the threat assessment level?" David asked. "Elevated, but not imminent," Sarah replied. "The extremist chatter is mostly rhetorical at this point, but we're monitoring for any signs of planning or coordination. I've got a protective detail on standby if needed." "Not yet," David said. "Bringing in obvious federal protection would blow my cover before we're ready for arrests, but keep monitoring the situation closely." The balance between maintaining operational security and ensuring personal safety was always delicate in undercover operations. David's safety depended on Kane's network continuing to see him as a vulnerable small business owner, rather than a federal agent with backup and resources. "How's your cover holding up otherwise?" Sarah asked. "Any signs that Kane suspects your true identity?" David thought about the morning's confrontation, Kane's confident arrogance and obvious surprise at David's calm resistance. He has no idea. He sees exactly what we want him to see, a successful black businessman who doesn't know his place. His racism makes him underestimate his targets, which is working in our favor. "Classic supremacist blindness," Sarah agreed. "They can't imagine that their victims might be more capable than they appear. It's the same arrogance that led him to create such detailed documentation of his own crimes." The psychological profile of Kane and his network had been crucial to the investigation's success. Their belief in their own superiority made them sloppy, confident that they could abuse their authority without consequences. That arrogance had created the evidence trail that would ultimately destroy them. "Sarah, I want to expand surveillance on Kane's personal residence," David said. "He's escalating, and I want to document any planning sessions or coordination meetings that happen outside official channels." "Already in motion," Sarah replied. "We've got eyes on his house, his favorite restaurant, and the private gun range where he meets with his inner circle. The surveillance team reports that he's been agitated since this morning, making more phone calls and having longer private conversations." David felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful investigation reaching its conclusion. Kane was reacting exactly as the psychological profile had predicted, escalating his harassment while inadvertently providing more evidence of his criminal behavior. "One final question," David said. "What's the post-arrest plan for my coffee shop? I've actually grown attached to the place, and the community deserves to keep it." Sarah smiled for the first time during their conversation. "The bureau's worked out an arrangement with a local nonprofit to take over operations if you want to maintain it. Community development through coffee shop entrepreneurship. It's actually a brilliant model for post-conflict rebuilding." David felt a warm surge of satisfaction. Common Grounds Coffee had started as an investigative cover, but it had become something more important, a symbol of what Madison County could become when freed from the systematic racism that had held it back for decades. The video call ended with final coordination details for the next phase of surveillance. David closed his laptops and moved to the window overlooking Main Street. The coffee shop's neon sign glowed softly in the darkness, a small beacon of hope in a community that would soon be transformed by the power of federal law enforcement. Sheriff Marcus Kane thought he was the most powerful man in Madison County. Tomorrow, he would begin to learn the difference between local authority and federal justice. The investigation that had begun with community complaints and individual courage was about to deliver the kind of systemic accountability that civil rights enforcement demanded. David Washington, FBI Civil Rights Division Chief, was ready to trade his coffee shop apron for his federal badge. But his commitment to this community would continue long after Kane was behind bars. ensuring that Madison County became an example of what American justice could accomplish when good people refused to accept the status quo. The harassment began at 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, exactly 48 hours after Kane's initial confrontation. David was preparing for the morning rush when he noticed the White County van parked outside Common Grounds Coffee, its occupants making no effort to conceal their surveillance of his business. The van's tinted windows couldn't hide the silhouettes of multiple figures inside, and the way they positioned themselves suggested this was coordinated observation rather than casual monitoring. David continued his opening routine with deliberate calm, grinding beans and cleaning the espresso machine, while mentally cataloging the surveillance tactics being employed against him. His federal training had taught him to recognize the signs of systematic harassment, and Kane's network was following a predictable playbook designed to create maximum disruption while maintaining the appearance of legitimate government oversight. The health inspector arrived first. Margaret Phillips was a thin, nervous woman in her 50s who had worked for Madison County for over 20 years. She entered the coffee shop with an oversized clipboard and an expression of apologetic resignation that suggested she understood exactly why she had been sent. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the counter, clearly uncomfortable with the role she was being forced to play in Kane's harassment campaign. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she approached the counter with obvious reluctance. "I'm Margaret Phillips from the County Health Department. I need to conduct an inspection of your food service facility." David dried his hands on a towel and smiled politely, though his mind was already analyzing the situation with the precision of a federal investigator. The timing, the nervous demeanor of the inspector, the surveillance van outside, everything pointed to coordinated harassment, designed to create the appearance of legitimate regulatory oversight while actually serving Kane's vendetta. "Of course, Miss Phillips," David said, maintaining his cover as a cooperative business owner. "I wasn't expecting an inspection so soon after opening, but everything is ready for review. May I ask what prompted this particular inspection?" Phillips glanced nervously at the front windows, where the county van remained parked with its occupants continuing their obvious surveillance. Her eyes darted between David and the windows as if she was afraid of being overheard by the wrong people. "I apologize for the short notice," she said, consulting her clipboard with the mechanical precision of someone following orders rather than conducting routine business. The phrase "concerns about public safety" was bureaucratic code for Kane's harassment campaign, and both David and Phillips knew it. But she was a county employee following orders from superiors who controlled her job security and pension benefits. Refusing to participate in Kane's vendetta would likely cost her the position she had held for 2 decades. "What specific safety concerns?" David asked, maintaining his facade of confused compliance while internally documenting every aspect of the harassment for his federal investigation file. "Food handling procedures, sanitation standards, permit compliance," Phillips recited from her clipboard, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone repeating memorized bureaucracy. "Standard inspection protocol for establishments that have received But nothing about this inspection was standard, and both participants understood the charade being performed. David had received his initial health department approval just 3 weeks earlier, after a thorough review that had found no violations. Emergency re-inspections were supposed to be triggered by specific incidents or documented complaints, not by law enforcement requests designed to harass legitimate businesses. Phillips spent the next 2 hours examining every inch of the coffee shop with microscopic attention to detail that went far beyond normal inspection procedures. She measured temperatures in refrigeration units with scientific precision, tested water temperatures at hand washing stations multiple times, and scrutinized food storage containers with the intensity of a forensic investigator searching for evidence in a criminal case. David cooperated fully, answering questions and providing documentation while mentally cataloging each step for his federal investigation file. Every manufactured concern, every creative interpretation of regulations, every desperate search for violations would become evidence in the civil rights prosecution that would ultimately destroy Kane's network. "Your espresso machine," Phillips said finally, her voice carrying the reluctant authority of someone who had been ordered to find problems, regardless of actual conditions. "The manufacturer's sticker shows it was imported from Italy." Do you have documentation proving it meets U.S. electrical safety standards? David retrieved the file folder containing all his equipment certifications, finding the relevant documents within seconds. The meticulous organization of his business records reflected both his genuine commitment to legitimate operation and his understanding that Kane's network would scrutinize every detail for potential violations. Here's the UL certification and the customs declaration showing it was properly inspected during import, David said, handing Phillips the comprehensive documentation that proved his equipment's compliance with all relevant safety standards. Phillips examined the paperwork with obvious disappointment, clearly hoping to find a violation that would justify Kane's harassment campaign. Her face fell as she realized that David's preparation and attention to detail had eliminated the easy targets that usually allowed corrupt officials to manufacture violations. "The certification is adequate," she said reluctantly, unable to identify any legitimate concerns with the imported equipment. "But I'm concerned about the positioning of the machine relative to the hand-washing station. County regulations require a minimum distance of 36 inches between food preparation equipment and sanitation facilities." David looked at the setup he had carefully planned, according to county regulations, then retrieved his original permit application, which included detailed floor plans that had been approved by Phillips's own department. The measurement had been verified during his initial inspection, but Kane's network was clearly willing to contradict their own previous approvals in order to create harassment opportunities. "The original inspection measured this distance at 38 inches, David said calmly, showing Phillips the documentation from 3 weeks earlier. "Here's the documentation from your department's initial approval." Phillips's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized she had been caught attempting to manufacture violations that contradicted her own department's documented findings. The floor plans clearly showed measurements that exceeded county requirements, and the initial inspection report confirmed compliance with all relevant standards. "I'll need to remeasure to ensure accuracy," she said weakly, pulling out a tape measure with obvious reluctance. The remeasurement confirmed the original finding of 38 inches, well above the required minimum distance. But Phillips continued her search for violations with increasing desperation, clearly under pressure to find problems that would justify the harassment campaign her superiors had ordered. She found fault with the angle of the menu board, questioning whether it created sightline obstructions that might constitute safety hazards. She questioned the cleanliness of surfaces that were spotless, demanding additional sanitization of equipment that had been cleaned according to industry standards. She insisted on reviewing additional documentation for permits that were clearly posted and current, searching for technicalities that might create compliance problems. At 9:30 a.m., while Phillips was still conducting her increasingly desperate inspection, the fire marshal arrived. Carl Rodriguez was a burly man in his 40s who wore his authority like a weapon, striding into the coffee shop with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating business owners through creative interpretation of safety regulations. "Fire safety inspection," Rodriguez announced without preamble, his voice carrying the bureaucratic authority that Kane's network used to disguise harassment as legitimate government oversight. "I've received reports of potential violations that could endanger public safety." David noticed that Rodriguez made no attempt to coordinate with Phillips, despite both inspections supposedly being routine procedures triggered by legitimate safety concerns. The simultaneous arrival of multiple inspectors suggested careful coordination designed to maximize disruption and create the appearance of multiple independent agencies identifying problems with his business. "What specific reports?" David asked, maintaining his cover as a confused business owner while knowing that no legitimate safety concerns existed. "Anonymous complaints about electrical hazards, blocked exits, and improper storage of flammable materials," Rodriguez said, pulling out a tablet computer and beginning his inspection without waiting for David's response. The electrical hazards allegation was particularly absurd, given that David had hired a licensed electrician to upgrade the building's wiring to current code standards before opening. The exit blockage claim was equally baseless. David had specifically designed the seating layout to ensure clear egress paths that exceeded code requirements. As for flammable materials, the coffee shop's storage consisted entirely of coffee beans, paper products, and cleaning supplies that were properly secured according to manufacturer specifications. Rodriguez spent an hour examining electrical outlets with theatrical intensity, measuring distances between furniture and exits with obsessive precision, and scrutinizing the storage area as if searching for evidence of major safety violations. Like Phillips, he seemed disappointed by his inability to find legitimate problems, growing increasingly creative in his interpretation of fire safety regulations. "Your emergency lighting system," Rodriguez said finally, pointing to the battery-powered exit signs that had been installed according to current fire codes. "The regulations require testing every 30 days with documented records maintained on site. Where are your test logs?" David retrieved the maintenance log from behind the counter, showing weekly tests that exceeded the required frequency. The documentation was comprehensive and professional, reflecting his commitment to legitimate business operation and his understanding that Kane's network would scrutinize every aspect of his compliance efforts. "Here are the records going back to opening day," David said, handing Rodriguez the detailed documentation that proved his commitment to safety compliance. Rodriguez examined the paperwork with obvious frustration before trying a different approach, searching for technicalities that might create violations where none actually existed. The batteries in these units could lose charge over time, creating a safety hazard during emergency situations, Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his interpretations accepted without question. "I'm recommending replacement within 30 days to ensure continued compliance with county safety standards." "The units are 3 weeks old," David replied calmly. "The manufacturer's warranty guarantees 5-year battery life, and the weekly tests consistently show full functionality according to industry standards." Rodriguez's face reddened with anger at being contradicted by someone he clearly considered beneath his authority. His bureaucratic power depended on business owners accepting his interpretations without question, and David's calm resistance was undermining his ability to manufacture the violations that Kane's harassment campaign required.
"Mr. Washington," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping to a threatening tone, "I'm the fire marshal for this county. When I identify potential safety concerns, business owners are expected to address them promptly and without argument."
The threat was implicit but clear: comply with unreasonable demands or face escalating harassment from Kane's network. It was exactly the kind of abuse of authority that federal investigators had documented in dozens of previous cases involving corrupt local officials who used their positions to intimidate legitimate businesses. "Marshal Rodriguez," David said calmly, maintaining his cover while internally cataloging the attempted intimidation for his federal case file. "I'm committed to maintaining the highest safety standards possible. If you can point to specific code violations, I'll address them immediately. But I need clear guidance on what changes are actually required by county regulations." Rodriguez's inability to identify genuine violations was becoming obvious to the customers who had witnessed the morning's harassment. Mrs. Henderson sat at her usual table, her expression growing increasingly angry as she watched county officials manufacture problems that clearly didn't exist. Jake Morrison had arrived for his morning coffee and remained standing near the counter, his construction workers' understanding of building codes making Rodriguez's creative interpretations particularly transparent. At 10:15 a.m., the building inspector arrived. Thomas Bradley, Jr., son of County Commissioner Bradley, and clearly positioned for political advancement through participation in Kane's harassment campaign, entered with an oversized briefcase and an attitude of bureaucratic authority that suggested he viewed this inspection as an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty to the corrupt network. "Zoning compliance inspection," Bradley announced, his voice carrying the entitled confidence of someone whose family connections provided protection from accountability. "We've received complaints that this establishment may be operating outside permitted use parameters." David felt a surge of controlled anger at the transparent abuse of authority. 3 simultaneous inspections from different county departments represented obvious harassment designed to disrupt his business and send a message to other potential black entrepreneurs about the consequences of challenging Kane's territorial control. "Mr. Bradley," David said, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally documenting the coordinated harassment, "my zoning permits are current and properly posted. The previous tenant operated a hardware store, And my coffee shop falls under the same commercial retail classification. Bradley opened his briefcase with theatrical flourish, removing a stack of zoning maps and regulation handbooks as if preparing for a complex legal analysis. His performance was designed to create the impression of thorough investigation while actually serving Kane's political agenda of driving David's business out of the county. Retail hardware sales and food service operations have different requirements for parking, waste disposal, and customer capacity, Bradley explained, with the bureaucratic authority that Kane's network used to disguise harassment as legitimate oversight. I need to verify that your current use doesn't exceed permitted parameters. The parking allegation was particularly absurd, given that Main Street provided unrestricted public parking and the coffee shop generated significantly less traffic than the previous hardware store. Waste disposal was handled by the same county service that had served the building for decades without problems. Customer capacity was well below the occupancy limits that had been established for the space during previous inspections. Bradley spent 45 minutes measuring the interior space with obsessive precision, counting tables and chairs as if documenting evidence for a court case, and reviewing parking availability with the dedication of someone whose political future depended on finding violations that would justify Kane's harassment campaign. Your current seating arrangement accommodates 32 customers, Bradley said finally, consulting his measurements and calculations with the authority of someone whose family connections made his interpretations politically powerful. But your zoning permit was issued for retail hardware sales with a maximum occupancy of 24 people. You're operating in violation of county occupancy regulations. David retrieved his business license application, which had included detailed floor plans and seating arrangements that were specifically reviewed and approved by Bradley's own department during the permit process. The documentation clearly showed that his occupancy calculations had been verified by county officials before he received permission to operate. The occupancy calculation was reviewed during the permit process, David said, showing Bradley the comprehensive documentation that contradicted his manufactured violation. Here's the approval showing that current seating capacity was specifically authorized by your department. Bradley examined the paperwork with obvious frustration, realizing that his attempted violation was directly contradicted by his own department's previous approval. The documentation was too clear and comprehensive to ignore, forcing him to search for alternative approaches to the harassment that Kane's network had ordered. Regulations may have changed since initial approval, he said weakly, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. I'll need to research current standards and provide updated guidance within 30 days. By 11 a.m., all 3 inspectors were completing their reports with obvious disappointment at their inability to find legitimate violations that would justify Kane's harassment campaign. David had cooperated fully, provided extensive documentation, and maintained professional demeanor throughout the coordinated attack on his business. But the message was clear. Kane's network would continue manufacturing problems until David gave up and closed his business. Mrs. Henderson approached the counter as the inspectors prepared to leave, her face flushed with indignation at the obvious abuse of authority she had witnessed. David, what just happened here was completely inappropriate, she said, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had spent decades observing institutional behavior. 3 simultaneous inspections for a business that just passed all county requirements 3 weeks ago? This is transparent harassment designed to drive you out of business. Jake Morrison nodded agreement, his construction experience making the manufactured violations particularly obvious to someone who understood building codes and regulatory compliance. I've worked with all 3 departments for years, Jake said, his anger evident in his voice. They don't coordinate inspections like this unless someone with political power is pulling strings behind the scenes. David appreciated their support and moral clarity, but he was also concerned about their safety in the face of Kane's demonstrated willingness to retaliate against anyone who challenged his authority. I appreciate your support more than you know, David said quietly, but I don't want anyone getting in trouble for defending my business against this kind of harassment. We're already in trouble, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had decided that moral courage required accepting personal risk. Sheriff Kane made that clear yesterday when he threatened me directly. The question is whether we're going to let him turn this community into a place where good people are afraid to do business." Her courage was inspiring, but David knew that Kane's escalation was just beginning. The failed inspections would be followed by other forms of systematic harassment, permit challenges, tax audits, code enforcement actions, and potentially more direct intimidation designed to destroy his business and drive him out of Madison County. At noon, David closed the coffee shop for lunch and contacted Agent Sarah Mitchell through encrypted channels, providing a detailed report on the morning's coordinated harassment campaign. 3 simultaneous inspections this morning, he reported. All failed to find legitimate violations, but they're building documentation for future harassment and testing the community's willingness to support my business. "We monitored county radio traffic during the inspections," Sarah replied. "All 3 were personally requested by Kane this morning, with specific instructions to find violations that would justify closure proceedings. The coordination provides additional evidence of civil rights violations and abuse of authority." "Timeline for arrests?" David asked, balancing his ability to endure continued harassment against his concern for community members who were supporting his business at personal risk. 72 hours, Sarah confirmed. The U.S. Attorney signed the indictments this morning, and the Marshal Service is finalizing tactical plans for simultaneous arrests Friday morning at 6 a.m. David felt relief and anticipation in equal measure. 72 more hours of maintaining his cover, while Kane's network escalated their harassment campaign. But then justice would arrive with the full weight of federal law enforcement to end Marcus Kane's reign of terror permanently. The investigation was entering its final phase, and Kane had no idea that his systematic harassment was providing exactly the evidence that federal prosecutors needed to ensure successful conviction of his entire corrupt network. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected visitor to Common Grounds Coffee. David was cleaning the espresso machine when Robert Patterson pushed through the front door at 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes before closing time. The hardware store owner looked nervous, his weathered hands fidgeting with a worn baseball cap as he glanced around the empty coffee shop. "Mr. Washington," Patterson said quietly, "I was hoping we could talk privately about what happened yesterday morning with those inspectors." David studied the older man's face, seeing worry lines deepened by years of running a small business in Kane's territory. Patterson had been friendly but cautious during their previous interactions, maintaining the polite distance of someone who understood the dangers of getting too involved in controversial situations. "Of course, Mr. Patterson. Can I get you some coffee?" "Just Bob," Patterson said, settling into a chair near the back of the coffee shop, away from the front windows. And yes, coffee would be good, black, no sugar. David prepared the drink and joined Patterson at the table, recognizing the body language of someone who had made a difficult decision and was struggling with the consequences. The hardware store owner sat hunched forward, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally began speaking. "What those county people did to you yesterday wasn't right," Patterson said. 3 inspections at once, looking for problems that don't exist. Trying to shut down a good business for no legitimate reason. I've seen it before, and it makes me sick every time. David leaned forward encouragingly. "You've seen similar harassment from Sheriff Kane's department?" Patterson nodded grimly, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup like it was providing warmth against a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. 5 years ago, there was a young couple named Marcus and Angela Williams who tried to open an auto repair shop on the east side of town. Good people, hard workers, everything legitimate about their business. The name was familiar from David's federal case files, but he let Patterson tell the story in his own words, understanding that personal testimony carried emotional weight that official reports couldn't capture. Marcus was a veteran, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home with mechanical skills that could fix anything with an engine. Angela was a business major, handled the books and customer service. They had saved for years, bought good equipment, did everything right. Patterson paused, staring into his coffee as if the memories were too painful to meet directly. Kane started visiting their shop within a week of opening. Always found something wrong. Safety violations that didn't exist, permit problems that had already been resolved, environmental concerns that were completely manufactured. Did they try to fight back? David asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear Patterson's perspective on the systematic nature of Kane's harassment. Marcus filed complaints with every agency he could think of, Patterson said. County commissioners, state attorney general, even contacted some lawyers. But Kane was smart about it. Never said anything overtly racist, always used official channels, made everything look legitimate on paper. David recognized the sophisticated methods that made Kane more dangerous than crude bigots who revealed their hatred openly. The sheriff understood how to weaponize bureaucracy, using the machinery of local government to achieve racist ends while maintaining plausible deniability. What finally happened to their business? Patterson's expression grew darker. Kane escalated when the complaints didn't stop. Suddenly, Marcus was getting pulled over every time he drove through town. Angela's car was randomly selected for inspection 3 times in 1 month. Their customers started getting hassled when they came to the shop. The pattern was exactly what David had documented in the federal investigation. Kane didn't just target individual business owners, he attacked their entire support network until the economic pressure became unbearable. Marcus held out for 8 months. Patterson continued, spent his savings on legal fees and compliance costs that shouldn't have existed. Finally gave up when Kane arranged for the county to discover foundation problems that required the building to be condemned. Foundation problems? Complete fabrication, Patterson said bitterly. I know the contractor who built that building. Solid construction, no structural issues. But Kane had connections in the building department, and they found exactly the problems they needed to find. David added the building department corruption to his mental list of federal charges that would be filed against Kane's network. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was becoming clearer with each conversation, revealing a network that extended throughout county government. Where are Marcus and Angela now? Moved to the next county over. Opened a shop there. Doing well from what I hear. But they should have been able to succeed here, in the community where they wanted to build their life. Patterson looked up from his coffee, meeting David's eyes directly for the first time during the conversation. That's why I came to talk to you tonight. Yesterday's harassment was exactly what they did to Marcus and Angela. 3 departments, simultaneous inspections, manufactured violations. It's the same playbook. David felt the weight of community history and the courage it had taken for Patterson to share these details. Bob, why are you telling me this? You know it could put you at risk with Sheriff Kane. Patterson's laugh was bitter and humorless. I'm already at risk, have been for years. Kane doesn't forgive people who support his targets, and he's got a long memory for anyone who challenges his authority. You supported Marcus and Angela? As much as I could without destroying my own business, Patterson said. Bought parts from their shop, recommended them to customers. Testified about the building's structural integrity when Kane tried to condemn it. Wasn't enough to save them, but it was all I could do. David heard the guilt in Patterson's voice. The regret of someone who had tried to help, but felt like he hadn't done enough. It was the moral burden carried by good people living under systematic oppression. The knowledge that individual resistance was rarely sufficient to overcome institutional corruption. You did what you could, David said. Supporting them at all took courage, especially knowing Kane's reputation for retaliation. Courage, Patterson repeated, shaking his head. I've been thinking about that word a lot since yesterday. Mrs. Henderson showed real courage, standing up to Kane in front of everyone. Jake Morrison, too. Makes me wonder what kind of man I've been, staying quiet for so long. Before David could respond, the front door chimed again. Sarah Chen entered, still wearing her hospital scrubs after finishing her night shift. She looked surprised to see Patterson at the back table, but approached them with the determined expression of someone who had made her own difficult decision. I hope I'm not interrupting, Sarah said, but I saw the lights on and wanted to talk to David about what happened yesterday. David gestured to an empty chair. Please join us, Sarah. Bob was just sharing some important history about Sheriff Kane's methods. Sarah settled into the chair, glancing between David and Patterson, as if gauging whether it was safe to speak openly. I've been thinking about those inspections all day. In my 15 years as a nurse, I've never seen county departments coordinate like that. unless there was a serious emergency. It wasn't an emergency, Patterson said quietly. It was harassment, pure and simple. Same thing they did to Marcus and Angela Williams 5 years ago. Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. The auto repair shop that closed so suddenly. I remember hearing about foundation problems, but it always seemed suspicious. The building had been fine for decades. Kane manufactured the problems, Patterson explained, used his connections throughout county government to create violations that didn't exist. Classic intimidation campaign designed to drive unwanted businesses out of the area. Sarah turned to David, her nurse's training making her instinctively assess his emotional state after the day's harassment. How are you holding up? Yesterday had to be incredibly stressful. I'm managing, David said, touched by her concern. But I'm worried about the people who are supporting my business. Kane made it clear that there would be consequences for anyone who stands up to him. Let him try, Sarah said with surprising fire. I've dealt with bullies before, and the only way to stop them is to stand together. Kane's powerful, but he's not more powerful than an entire community united for justice. Patterson looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. You're not afraid of retaliation? Kane has a long reach in this county. Of course I'm afraid, Sarah admitted. But I'm more afraid of what happens if good people stay silent while he destroys everything decent about this community. David's coffee shop represents something important, proof that our town can be welcoming to everyone. David felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah's courage and clarity. She understood exactly what was at stake, not just for his business, but for the community's soul. Her willingness to take risks for justice exemplified the kind of moral leadership that could transform Madison County. Sarah's right about standing together, Patterson said slowly, as if the idea was crystallizing as he spoke. Kane's been getting away with this for years because he picks off people one at a time, isolates them, makes them feel like they're fighting alone. You think there are others who would be willing to speak up? David asked, knowing the answer from his federal investigation, but wanting to hear the community perspective. More than you might think, Patterson said. People are tired of living in fear, tired of watching good businesses get destroyed for no reason other than Kane's personal prejudices. Sarah nodded agreement. At the hospital, we've had conversations about Kane's behavior for years. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak up, but if there was a group, a way to support each other. David saw an opportunity to strengthen both his investigation and the community's resistance to Kane's harassment. What if we organized a meeting, informal, just people who are concerned about abuse of authority and want to support local businesses? Patterson and Sarah exchanged glances, both recognizing the potential power and danger of such a gathering. Kane would see it as a direct challenge to his authority, but it might also create the community solidarity needed to resist his harassment campaigns. When? Sarah asked. Tomorrow night, David said. After closing, right here in the coffee shop, we can discuss ways to support each other and document what's been happening. Patterson hesitated, understanding the risks but also recognizing the necessity. Kane will hear about it within hours. His network has eyes and ears throughout the community. Let him hear about it, Sarah said defiantly. Maybe it's time he understood that this community won't be intimidated by his tactics anymore. David felt the electric energy of resistance organizing itself, the moment when individual courage began transforming into collective action. It was exactly what federal investigators hoped to see, communities finding the strength to challenge systematic oppression rather than waiting for outside salvation. I'll reach out to Mrs. Henderson and Jake Morrison, Sarah said, and I know other people at the hospital who are disgusted by Kane's behavior. I can contact some of the other business owners, Patterson added, quietly, carefully, but there are people who will want to be part of this. As they finalized plans for the next evening's meeting, David realized that his undercover investigation had evolved into something larger and more important than he had initially planned. The coffee shop had become a genuine symbol of resistance, and the community was finding its voice in opposition to Kane's reign of terror. The federal arrests were still 48 hours away, but the community organizing that was happening around David's business would continue long after Kane was in custody. This was how real change occurred, not just through federal intervention, but through local people finding the courage to stand up for their values and support each other in the face of institutional oppression. By 9 p.m., the impromptu strategy session had ended with concrete plans for community organization. Patterson and Sarah left through the back door, understanding the need for discretion while Kane's network was watching the coffee shop closely. David cleaned the espresso machine and prepared for closing, his mind already working through the implications of tomorrow's community meeting. Kane would inevitably learn about it, probably within hours of it happening. The sheriff's response would likely be swift and aggressive, designed to break up the organizing effort before it could gain momentum. But David had 48 hours until federal arrests dismantled Kane's network. The community meeting would provide additional evidence of Kane's systematic harassment, while also building the local resistance that would be crucial for long-term healing and reform. As he locked the front door and turned off the lights, David reflected on the courage of ordinary people like Patterson and Sarah. They were risking their safety and livelihoods to support justice, demonstrating the kind of moral leadership that made communities strong enough to resist oppression. The investigation was entering its final phase, but the real work of community building was just beginning. And when Kane's reign of terror ended, Madison County would be ready to become the kind of place where businesses like Common Grounds Coffee could thrive without fear of harassment or intimidation. David Washington, FBI Civil Rights Division Chief, was fighting for more than just individual justice. He was fighting for the soul of a community that deserved the chance to live up to its highest values, free from the systematic racism that had held it back for far too long. Thursday evening arrived with the electric tension of a storm building on the horizon. David had spent the day serving customers and fielding quiet inquiries about the community meeting scheduled for 8. Word had spread through careful whispers and coded conversations, reaching exactly the people who needed to hear it while hopefully avoiding Kane's extensive surveillance network. At 7:30 p.m., David began setting up chairs in the back area of Common Grounds Coffee, arranging them in a circle that would encourage open conversation while keeping the gathering away from the front windows. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, carrying a manila folder thick with documentation that she placed carefully on the counter. "I've been collecting information about Sheriff Kane's behavior for over 2 years," she said, her librarian's instincts having created a comprehensive archive of incidents and patterns. Newspaper articles, court records, complaints that were filed and mysteriously dismissed. It's all here. Jake Morrison entered through the back door at 7:45, followed by Sarah Chen and Robert Patterson. By 8 p.m., 12 community members had gathered in the coffee shop, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and anxiety about directly challenging Kane's authority. David recognized most of the faces from his weeks serving the community, but seeing them assembled for resistance rather than coffee created a different dynamic. These weren't just customers, they were citizens who had decided to risk their own safety to support justice and community values. "Thank you all for coming," David began, standing near the circle of chairs but not taking a position of authority that might make him a target for Kane's retaliation. "I think we all understand why we're here. The harassment I've experienced this week isn't unique. It's part of a pattern that's been damaging our community for years." Pastor Williams from the Baptist Church nodded gravely. "I've been wanting to address this issue from the pulpit, but I've been afraid of the consequences for my congregation. Sheriff Kane has made it clear that churches who criticize law enforcement face closer scrutiny of their tax-exempt status." The threat against religious institutions revealed another dimension of Kane's systematic abuse of authority. Using tax enforcement to silence critical voices was a federal crime that would strengthen the civil rights prosecution significantly. Dr. Martinez from the county hospital leaned forward in his chair. "At the hospital, we've documented a pattern of Black patients receiving different treatment when they arrive with police escorts. Kane's officers often insist on remaining in examination rooms, claiming security concerns that don't exist with white patients." David made mental notes of each revelation, understanding that he was witnessing the community finally finding its voice after years of imposed silence. Every story added evidence to the federal case while also building the solidarity that would be necessary for long-term healing. The economic impact is devastating, added Carol Thompson, who owned a small bakery that supplied pastries to several businesses. Black customers avoid shopping in areas where they might encounter Kane's patrols. We're losing revenue because people don't feel safe in our downtown. Robert Patterson spoke up from across the circle. I shared Marcus and Angela Williams' story with David yesterday, but there are others. The Johnson family who couldn't buy a house because of mysterious inspection problems. The Santos restaurant that closed after constant harassment. We're talking about systematic exclusion of black families from our community. Mrs. Henderson opened her folder and began reading from her careful documentation. In the past 3 years, 8 black-owned businesses have attempted to establish operations in Madison County. 7 failed within 6 months due to what they described as insurmountable regulatory obstacles and hostile law enforcement. The statistics painted a clear picture of systematic racism, disguised as bureaucratic enforcement. Kane's network had created an environment where black entrepreneurship was virtually impossible, maintaining economic segregation through abuse of official authority. The question is what we can do about it, Sarah Chen said. We're documenting the problems, but how do we create accountability for Sheriff Kane and his network? David was about to respond when the front door exploded inward, with a crash that made everyone in the circle jump to their feet. Sheriff Marcus Kane stood silhouetted in the doorway, his imposing frame backlit by the streetlights outside. He wasn't alone. Deputies Mitchell and Torres flanked him, their hands resting casually on their service weapons. Well, Kane's voice carried the dangerous calm of a predator that had cornered its prey. Looks like we've got ourselves a little conspiracy meeting. Planning to overthrow the county government, are we? The community members pressed closer together, instinctively, their earlier courage challenged by the sudden appearance of armed law enforcement. David stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Kane and the civilians who had shown such bravery in attending the meeting. Sheriff Kane, this is a private gathering on private property, David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. You have no legal authority to enter without a warrant or invitation. Kane's laugh was harsh and threatening as he stepped fully into the coffee shop, his deputies spreading out to flank the assembled community members. Legal authority? Boy, I am the legal authority in this county. When I say a gathering is suspicious, it becomes my business to investigate. Deputy Mitchell moved toward the circle of chairs, his hand still resting on his weapon, in a gesture designed to maximize intimidation. Looks like seditious conspiracy to me, Sheriff. Maybe we should arrest them all for plotting against law enforcement. The threat was so blatantly illegal that several community members gasped audibly. Pastor Williams stepped forward with the moral authority of his position, but his voice carried a tremor that revealed his fear. Sheriff Kane, we're simply exercising our constitutional right to peaceful assembly. There's nothing illegal about citizens discussing community concerns. Kane's attention swiveled to the pastor with predatory focus. Pastor Williams, isn't it? Funny thing about tax-exempt religious organizations, they lose their special status when they start engaging in political activities. Might be time for an audit of your church's finances. The threat was delivered with casual venom, designed to terrify not just Pastor Williams, but anyone else who might consider challenging Kane's authority. David felt his federal agent instincts screaming at him to reveal his true identity and arrest Kane for civil rights violations. But maintaining his cover was crucial to the broader investigation. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with the fierce courage that had made her a pillar of the community for decades. Sheriff Kane, your behavior is completely inappropriate. We're American citizens exercising our constitutional rights, and you have no authority to threaten us. Kane's face flushed red with rage at being challenged by an elderly librarian in front of his deputies and the assembled community. He took 3 quick steps toward Mrs. Henderson, his bulk making her seem tiny and vulnerable by comparison. You old bag, you have no idea who you're dealing with, Kane snarled, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Maybe it's time you learned what happens to people who don't know their place in my county. David felt something snap inside him as Kane menaced the woman who had shown such courage in supporting his business. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to use his federal authority and tactical training to protect the innocent civilians who were being terrorized by corrupt law enforcement. But revealing his identity now would compromise 18 months of investigation and potentially allow other members of Kane's network to escape justice. David forced himself to respond as a civilian business owner rather than a federal agent, even though it felt like betraying the people who had trusted him enough to attend this meeting. "Sheriff, please step back from Mrs. Henderson," David said, moving closer to Kane, but maintaining the non-threatening posture of someone trying to de-escalate rather than confront. "There's no need for this kind of aggression." Kane whirled toward David with explosive violence, his hand moving to his service weapon as his face contorted with rage. "You think you can give me orders, boy? You think your fancy coffee shop makes you somebody important in my county?" Deputy Torres moved to Kane's right side, creating a crossfire position that any tactical expert would recognize as preparation for violence. The assembled community members pressed even closer together, several of them moving toward the back exit as the situation spiraled toward potential bloodshed. "I'm not giving orders," David said carefully, his hands visible and non-threatening despite every federal agent instinct screaming at him to take control of the situation. "I'm just asking for calm discussion rather than intimidation." Kane drew his service weapon with practiced speed, holding it at his side, but making the threat unmistakable. The assembled community members cried out in shock and terror, several of them backing toward the rear of the coffee shop as the situation crossed the line from harassment into potential violence. "This is what calm discussion looks like in my county," Kane said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of someone who had lost all pretense of legal authority. "You and your little friends here are going to learn what happens when outsiders try to change the way we do things." Sarah Chen moved protectively in front of Mrs. Henderson, her nurse's training making her instinctively shield the most vulnerable person present. "Sheriff Kane, please put your weapon away. There are no threats here. No reason for violence." Kane's attention shifted to Sarah with the predatory focus of someone who had identified another target for intimidation. "The little hospital nurse wants to play hero? Maybe it's time we reviewed your employment background, made sure you're suitable for working with vulnerable patients." The threat against Sarah's professional livelihood was designed to demonstrate Kane's reach throughout the community's institutions. No one was safe from his retaliation, no matter how important their job or how necessary their services. David felt his cover identity cracking under the pressure of watching innocent people being terrorized by someone he had the power to stop. 18 months of investigation, carefully gathered evidence, and coordinated federal planning, all of it balanced against the immediate safety of community members who had shown such courage in standing up for justice. "Sheriff Kane," David said, his voice carrying an undertone of authority that made Kane's eyes narrow with suspicion. "You're threatening innocent civilians who are exercising their constitutional rights. This needs to stop now." Kane took a step closer to David, his weapon still drawn, his deputies flanking him with their own hands on their guns. The coffee shop that had been a symbol of community and welcome had become a potential crime scene, with armed corrupt officers threatening unarmed citizens. "You know what I think, boy?" Kane said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I think you're not what you appear to be. I think there's something about you that doesn't add up, something that explains why you're so comfortable challenging law enforcement." David felt ice in his veins as Kane's suspicious gaze studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The sheriff's instincts were warning him that David wasn't just another vulnerable business owner, even though Kane couldn't articulate what was different. "I'm exactly what I appear to be," David said carefully. "A small business owner who wants to serve this community and support my neighbors." Kane's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "We'll see about that. Boys, I think it's time we conducted a more thorough investigation of Mr. Washington's background and business operations." Deputy Mitchell stepped forward with eager anticipation. "Want us to take him in for questioning, Sheriff?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with Kane's paranoia and David's federal cover both reaching their breaking points. David knew that submitting to arrest would blow his investigation, but resisting would reveal his true identity and training. Either choice would compromise the 18-month federal operation that was scheduled to conclude in less than 24 hours. "Not tonight," Kane said finally, holstering his weapon but keeping his threatening posture. "But Mr. Washington and his friends here need to understand that their little resistance movement ends now. Anyone who continues supporting this business or attending meetings like this will face the full weight of law enforcement scrutiny." Kane turned to address the assembled community members, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You people need to think carefully about the company you keep and the causes you support. This county has been peaceful for years because people understand their place and respect authority. Don't let an outsider destroy what we've built here." The veiled threat was clear: support David's business or face systematic harassment from Kane's network. The sheriff was forcing the community to choose between justice and safety, between moral courage and practical survival. Kane and his deputies backed toward the front door, their weapons holstered but their message delivered. As they reached the threshold, Kane turned back to David with a final warning. 24 hours, boy. You've got 24 hours to close this business and disappear from my county. After that, things get serious." The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving the coffee shop in stunned silence. The assembled community members stood frozen for several long moments, processing the violence they had just witnessed and the threats that had been made against them. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak, her voice shaking, but still carrying the moral authority that had made her a community leader. "David, I am so sorry you had to experience that. Sheriff Kane's behavior was completely unacceptable." "We all experienced it," David replied, his mind racing through the implications of Kane's ultimatum. "And I'm sorry that supporting my business has put all of you at risk." Sarah Chen moved to check on Mrs. Henderson, her medical training making her assess the elderly woman for signs of shock or distress. "Are you okay? That was incredibly frightening." "I'm fine," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Angry, but fine. Sheriff Kane just demonstrated exactly why this community needs to stand together against his abuse of authority." Robert Patterson looked around the circle of community members, his face reflecting the fear and determination that everyone was feeling. "Kane's escalating because he's scared. This meeting, David's business, our willingness to speak up, it's threatening his control." Pastor Williams nodded agreement, though his hands were still trembling from the encounter. When oppressors resort to threats of violence, it means their other methods are failing. Kane knows he's losing his grip on this community. David felt immense pride in the courage these ordinary citizens were showing in the face of armed intimidation. They understood exactly what was at stake and were choosing justice over safety, community over fear. But he also knew that Kane's 24-hour ultimatum aligned perfectly with the federal arrest timeline. In 18 hours, U.S. Marshals would take Kane and his network into custody, ending their reign of terror permanently. David just had to maintain his cover for one more day while protecting the community members who had shown such bravery in supporting his mission. As the meeting gradually dissolved and people began leaving through the back door for their own safety, David reflected on how close Kane had come to discovering his true identity. The sheriff's instincts were warning him that David was more than he appeared, but Kane's arrogance and racism prevented him from imagining that a black coffee shop owner might be a federal agent with the power to destroy his entire operation. 24 hours until Kane's ultimatum expired. 18 hours until federal arrests began. The investigation was in its final phase, and the breaking point had arrived for everyone involved. David Washington, FBI Civil Rights Division Chief, was ready for the storm that was coming, and when it arrived, Marcus Kane would learn that some people who appear vulnerable are actually the most dangerous opponents he could ever face. Friday morning arrived with deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that precedes monumental change. David opened Common Ground's coffee at 6 a.m. as usual, going through the familiar motions of grinding beans and preparing the espresso machine, while his mind counted down the hours until Kane's ultimatum expired. The federal arrest operation was scheduled to begin in exactly 30 minutes, but the community had no way of knowing that their long nightmare was about to end. The morning routine felt surreal knowing what was coming. David arranged pastries in the display case, wiped down already clean counters, and checked the coffee inventory with the methodical precision that had characterized his 18 months of deep cover. Every movement was calculated to maintain the illusion of normalcy, while federal agents positioned themselves throughout Madison County for the largest civil rights enforcement operation in the region's history. Mrs. Henderson arrived at 6:30 for what she assumed might be her last coffee at David's shop. Her face carried the determined sadness of someone saying goodbye to something precious that was being destroyed by forces beyond her control. She moved slowly, as if trying to memorize every detail of the space that had become a symbol of resistance and community. "David," she said quietly, settling into her usual corner booth with the weight of someone who had made peace with defeat. "I want you to know how much your business has meant to this community. Whatever happens today, you've shown us what's possible when good people refuse to be intimidated." David felt a surge of emotion at her words, knowing that in less than 30 minutes she would understand why he had been able to remain so calm in the face of Kane's escalating harassment. The elderly librarian had shown such courage, such unwavering support in the face of direct threats from armed law enforcement. She deserved to see justice delivered. "Mrs. Henderson," David said carefully, preparing her extra cinnamon cappuccino with special attention to the foam art, "I need you to trust me when I say that today is going to be very different than you expect." Before she could ask what he meant, Jake Morrison burst through the front door with the urgency of someone bearing important news. His construction worker's clothes were still damp with morning dew, suggesting he had come directly from an early job site to deliver his information. "David, you need to see this," Jake said breathlessly, his eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "There are federal agents all over the courthouse and sheriff's department. Black SUVs, tactical gear, guys in body armor. Looks like something out of a movie. They've got the whole downtown area cordoned off." David felt his heart rate accelerate as the operation he had helped plan for 18 months finally began. Through the front windows, he could see the first signs of federal law enforcement presence. Unmarked vehicles positioning themselves at key intersections, agents in tactical gear moving with the precise coordination of a major arrest operation. "How many agents?" David asked, maintaining his cover of curious business owner while internally monitoring the operation's progress. "Dozens," Jake replied, moving to the window to get a better view. "Maybe hundreds. I've never seen anything like it. They've got snipers on rooftops, command vehicles, the whole federal law enforcement apparatus. Someone's in serious trouble." Sarah Chen arrived moments later, still wearing her hospital scrubs after finishing another night shift. Her nurse's training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but her face showed the stress of someone processing unprecedented events. "The emergency radio at the hospital is going crazy," she said breathlessly, joining Jake at the window. "Reports of federal marshals surrounding multiple county buildings. FBI, DEA, ATF, every agency you can think of. David, what's happening? Do you think this has something to do with Kane's threats against you?" David moved to the front windows and saw the unmistakable signs of Operation Clean Sweep reaching its culmination. U.S. Marshals in tactical gear were establishing perimeters around the courthouse, sheriff's department, and county administration building. The synchronized precision of their movements indicated that arrest warrants were being executed simultaneously across Kane's entire network. Federal snipers had taken positions on strategic rooftops, their presence designed to prevent any coordinated resistance from Kane's network of corrupt law enforcement officers. Mobile command units blocked key intersections, while teams of agents in full tactical gear approached target buildings with the overwhelming force necessary to arrest armed and potentially dangerous suspects. "Look," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing toward the sheriff's department, where a stream of federal agents was escorting handcuffed figures toward waiting transport vehicles. "They're arresting deputies, multiple deputies." David recognized several of the figures being led away in federal custody. Deputies Mitchell and Torres, who had participated in Kane's harassment campaigns, along with other officers who had been identified as part of the systematic civil rights conspiracy. At exactly 7 a.m., David's encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Agent Sarah Mitchell. Primary target secured. All secondary arrests proceeding on schedule. You're clear to break cover. David looked around the coffee shop at the faces of the community members who had shown such courage in supporting his business and challenging Kane's authority. Mrs. Henderson sat transfixed by the federal operation unfolding outside her window. Jake Morrison watched with the fascination of someone witnessing history. Sarah Chen maintained her professional composure while clearly processing the implications of such massive federal intervention. After 18 months of deception, it was time to reveal the truth about his identity and mission. Mrs. Henderson, Jake, Sarah, David said, his voice carrying a new tone of authority that made them look at him with surprise. I need to tell you something important about who I really am and why I'm here. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. The deferential posture he had maintained during Kane's harassment disappeared, replaced by the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. His voice carried the crisp precision of federal law enforcement training, while his eyes showed the sharp intelligence of an investigator who had been analyzing every interaction for 18 months. David, Mrs. Henderson said uncertainly, sensing the change but not understanding its implications. Before he could continue, the front door exploded open as Sheriff Marcus Kane stormed into the coffee shop with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. His uniform was disheveled, his face flushed with panic and rage. Sweat stained his shirt despite the cool morning air, and his hands shook with the adrenaline of someone whose world was collapsing around him. He was alone, a clear sign that his deputies were among those being arrested by federal agents throughout the county. Kane's isolation was complete, his network of corrupt officers either in custody or fleeing to avoid the federal dragnet that had descended on Madison County. "You!" Kane snarled, pointing at David with a trembling finger that betrayed his desperate emotional state. "This is all you're doing, isn't it? Federal agents crawling all over my county, arresting my people. What kind of setup is this?" Kane's eyes were wild with the panic of someone who had built his entire identity around unchecked power and was now watching that power evaporate in real time. The calm authority he had wielded for 15 years meant nothing in the face of federal law enforcement, and the realization was destroying his psychological foundation. David stood calmly behind the counter, no longer needing to maintain the submissive posture he had adopted during Kane's previous harassment. His federal agent training was evident in his steady stance and controlled breathing, though Kane was too panicked to notice the transformation. "Sheriff Kane," David said quietly, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who had anticipated this moment for months. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who I really am." Kane drew his service weapon with shaking hands, his desperation overriding any remaining pretense of legal authority. The Glock trembled in his grip as he pointed it toward David, but his stance was sloppy, emotional rather than tactical. Years of bullying unarmed civilians had left him unprepared for confronting a trained federal agent. "You're some kind of federal plant, aren't you?" Kane demanded, his voice cracking with stress. "FBI? DEA? Which agency sent you to destroy my county?" Mrs. Henderson, Jake, and Sarah pressed back against the wall, terrified by Kane's drawn weapon but unable to leave with the sheriff blocking the front door. David stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Kane and the civilians who had shown such courage in supporting his mission. "Put the weapon down, Sheriff," David said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in dangerous situations. "You're already facing multiple federal charges. Don't make this worse by threatening innocent civilians." Kane's eyes widened as he processed David's tone and demeanor. The submissive coffee shop owner had vanished, replaced by someone who moved and spoke with the confidence of a trained law enforcement professional. The transformation was so complete that Kane took an involuntary step backward, suddenly uncertain about who he was actually confronting. "You're not just some coffee shop owner," Kane whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "You're fucking FBI." David reached slowly into his shirt pocket, moving with deliberate care to avoid triggering Kane's already unstable emotional state. He withdrew the leather credential case that he had kept hidden for 18 months, feeling the weight of federal authority that had been concealed beneath his civilian cover. He opened the credentials to reveal his official identification and the gold badge that marked him as FBI Civil Rights Division Chief. The shield caught the morning light streaming through the coffee shop windows, its official authority creating a moment of profound silence as everyone in the room processed the revelation. David Washington, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division Chief, he said formally, his voice carrying 18 months of suppressed federal authority. Sheriff Marcus Kane, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. The revelation hit Kane like a physical blow. His weapon wavered in his shaking hands as he stared at the federal credentials that transformed David from vulnerable target to the agent of his destruction. The gold badge represented everything Kane had spent his career defying: federal oversight, civil rights enforcement, accountability for local law enforcement. Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized that the quiet coffee shop owner who had served her cappuccino every morning was actually a high-ranking federal law enforcement official. The man who had remained calm during Kane's most violent threats, who had shown such grace under pressure, was someone with the authority to arrest sheriffs and dismantle corrupt networks. Jake Morrison's eyes widened with amazement and sudden understanding of David's calm confidence in the face of systematic harassment. "You're FBI Civil Rights Division Chief?" he said incredulously. "The whole time you've been conducting a federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations in Madison County," David confirmed, his professional demeanor now fully revealed. 18 months of documented harassment, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to maintain racial segregation through illegal means. Kane's face cycled through shock, rage, and desperate calculation as he processed the scope of the federal investigation. The coffee shop owner, who had remained mysteriously calm during every confrontation, was actually the federal official with the power to destroy his entire operation. "You can't prove anything," Kane said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's your word against mine, and I'm an elected sheriff with 15 years of service." David smiled for the first time since revealing his identity, the expression carrying the satisfaction of an investigator who had built an airtight case through patient, methodical work. "Sheriff Kane, we have recorded conversations between you and County Commissioner Bradley, coordinating harassment campaigns. We have documented evidence of manufactured violations designed to drive black businesses out of the county. We have witnessed testimony from dozens of victims spanning 5 years of systematic abuse." Kane's weapon drooped as the full scope of the federal investigation became clear. "How much do you have?" "Everything," David replied with quiet finality. "Wiretapped phone calls, surveillance footage, financial records showing coordination between corrupt officials, documented patterns of discriminatory enforcement. Your network has been under comprehensive federal surveillance for over a year." The front door opened again, and Agent Sarah Mitchell entered with 4 U.S. Marshals in full tactical gear. Their body armor was marked with federal insignia, their weapons drawn but held in professional ready positions. Kane spun toward them with his weapon raised, but the overwhelming presence of federal firepower made resistance clearly suicidal. "Sheriff Kane," Agent Mitchell said with professional calm, her voice carrying the authority of someone backed by the full weight of federal law enforcement, "drop your weapon and place your hands behind your head. You are under arrest on federal charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of authority under color of law, and intimidation of federal witnesses." Kane looked wildly between David and the federal agents, his world collapsing as he realized the scope of the investigation that had brought down his entire operation. The coffee shop that he had viewed as his territory was now revealed as the headquarters of a federal operation designed to destroy him. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon and let it fall to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent coffee shop. The U.S. Marshals moved with practiced efficiency, securing Kane's weapon and placing him in federal custody with the specialized restraints used for law enforcement prisoners. As they read him his rights, Kane stared at David with pure hatred mixed with grudging respect for the sophisticated operation that had outmaneuvered his entire corrupt network. "How long have you been planning this?" Kane asked as the marshals prepared to escort him from the coffee shop that had become the symbol of his downfall. "Since the first complaint was filed against you 3 years ago," David replied, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority that had been hidden for so long. "The Department of Justice doesn't tolerate systematic civil rights violations, Sheriff. Your reign of terror is over." Agent Mitchell approached David with professional congratulations mixed with obvious relief. The operation she had coordinated from the field office had required unprecedented resources and coordination between multiple federal agencies. "Outstanding work, Chief Washington," she said formally. 18 months of deep cover operation, and you delivered exactly the evidence we needed for successful prosecution of the entire conspiracy network." Mrs. Henderson found her voice as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her librarian's mind processing the incredible revelation that had just unfolded before her eyes. "David, Chief Washington, you've been working undercover this entire time?" she asked, her voice mixing awe with gratitude for the sacrifice he had made to protect their community. David turned to face the community members who had shown such courage in supporting his mission without knowing his true identity. Their faces reflected shock, amazement, and growing understanding of why he had been able to remain so calm during Kane's escalating harassment campaign. "I'm sorry for the deception," David said sincerely, "but it was necessary to document the full scope of Sheriff Kane's criminal network. Everything you've witnessed, every act of harassment and intimidation, has been evidence in a federal civil rights investigation designed to protect this community." As Kane was escorted from the coffee shop in federal custody, David watched the man who had terrorized the community for years, reduced to just another criminal facing justice. The uniform and badge that Kane had abused for so long meant nothing in the face of federal law enforcement and constitutional authority. The revelation was complete, but the work of justice was just beginning. 6 months later, David Washington stood behind the familiar counter of Common Grounds Coffee, preparing morning drinks for customers who no longer feared harassment from corrupt law enforcement. The federal courthouse across town had just concluded the final sentencing hearing in United States v. Kane et al., marking the end of the most comprehensive civil rights prosecution in the region's history. The transformation of Madison County had been remarkable to witness. Where once black families had avoided the downtown area out of fear, now the morning rush included faces from every demographic, creating the kind of integrated community that civil rights enforcement was designed to protect. The coffee shop had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of what American communities could achieve when freed from systematic oppression. Mrs. Henderson entered at her usual time, but her demeanor carried the lightness of someone who no longer feared retaliation for supporting justice. She had testified as a key witness in the federal trial, her detailed documentation proving crucial to establishing the pattern of harassment that had defined Kane's operation. "Good morning, Chief Washington," she said with a smile that had become broader and more genuine over the past 6 months. "I heard the news about Kane's sentencing. 25 years federal prison?" David nodded as he prepared her extra cinnamon cappuccino, the familiar routine now enhanced by the knowledge that it represented freely chosen community rather than courage in the face of oppression. 25 years without possibility of parole. Judge Harrison got 15 years. Commissioner Bradley got 12. The entire network is going to federal prison. The sentences had been severe, but appropriate for the scope of the conspiracy. Federal prosecutors had successfully argued that Kane's network had operated as a criminal organization, using the machinery of county government to maintain racial segregation through systematic violation of constitutional rights. The evidence David had gathered during his undercover operation had provided the foundation for convictions that would send a clear message about federal commitment to civil rights enforcement. Jake Morrison arrived with his usual construction worker's energy, but his relationship with David had deepened since learning about the federal investigation. The knowledge that his morning coffee companion was actually FBI Civil Rights Division chief had initially been shocking, but it had evolved into profound respect for the sacrifice David had made to protect their community. "Dave, sorry, Chief. I keep meaning to ask," Jake said, settling into his preferred spot at the counter. "Are you staying permanently, or is this just temporary while you finish up the federal case?" It was a question David had been asking himself for months. The Department of Justice had offered him multiple promotions and transfers to headquarters positions that would advance his career significantly. But Common Grounds Coffee had become more than an investigative cover. It represented a model for community healing that had implications far beyond Madison County. "I'm staying," David said firmly, handing Jake his large black coffee with extra shot. "This place has become something special, and the work we're doing here is too important to abandon." The decision had not been easy. Remaining in Madison County meant turning down prestigious assignments and slowing his advancement within the FBI hierarchy. But the community building that had emerged from the federal investigation represented exactly the kind of long-term change that civil rights enforcement was designed to achieve. Sarah Chen entered with her post-night shift exhaustion, but her face carried the satisfaction of someone who worked in a hospital that was no longer subject to discriminatory law enforcement practices. The changes in healthcare delivery had been dramatic. Black patients no longer faced hostile police presence during treatment, and the staff could focus on medical care rather than managing law enforcement tensions. "Morning, David," she said, using the first name that had become comfortable again after months of adjusting to his revealed identity. "I heard there was a celebration at the federal courthouse yesterday after the final sentencing." "Quiet celebration," David replied, understanding that justice needed to be acknowledged without appearing vindictive toward the communities where convicted officials had families and supporters. "The important thing is that the systematic violations have ended and the community can move forward." The federal prosecution had been comprehensive but careful to distinguish between individual accountability and community healing. Prosecutors had emphasized that the convictions targeted specific criminal behavior rather than the broader community, creating space for reconciliation and reform rather than permanent division. Dr. Martinez from the county hospital entered with the purposeful stride of someone bringing important news. As the chief of staff, he had become an unofficial spokesperson for the institutional changes that had transformed Madison County's relationship with federal oversight. "David, I wanted to update you on the hospital's new partnership with the FBI Civil Rights Division," Dr. Martinez said, accepting his usual Colombian blend with appreciation. "We're implementing the training protocols you helped design, teaching our staff to recognize and report civil rights violations in healthcare settings." The institutional reforms had extended far beyond law enforcement. The Department of Justice had worked with local hospitals, schools, and businesses to implement comprehensive civil rights training and oversight mechanisms. David's unique position as both federal investigator and community member had made him instrumental in designing programs that addressed systematic issues while respecting local autonomy. "How's the staff responding to the training?" David asked, genuinely interested in the long-term sustainability of the reforms. "Better than expected," Dr. Martinez replied. "People want to do the right thing. They just needed clear guidance and protection from retaliation. Knowing that federal oversight is permanent has given everyone confidence to report problems rather than staying silent." The permanent federal oversight was a crucial component of the settlement agreement that had emerged from the prosecution. Rather than simply punishing individual violations, the Department of Justice had implemented ongoing monitoring and support systems designed to prevent future systematic abuse. Pastor Williams entered with the dignified bearing of someone whose moral authority had been vindicated by federal action. His church had become a center for community healing and reconciliation, hosting forums where residents could process the trauma of systematic oppression while building bridges toward a more inclusive future. "Chief Washington," Pastor Williams said formally, using the title that acknowledged David's federal authority while respecting his choice to remain embedded in the community. "I wanted to thank you again for speaking at our reconciliation service last week. Your message about justice requiring both accountability and healing really resonated with the congregation." The reconciliation work had been among the most challenging aspects of David's post-investigation role. Many community members struggled with feelings of guilt about their previous silence, while others resented federal intervention in local affairs. Creating space for honest dialogue while maintaining progress toward equality required careful navigation of complex emotions and competing interests. "Pastor, your leadership has been crucial to the healing process," David replied sincerely. The church's willingness to host difficult conversations has created a model that other communities can follow. Robert Patterson arrived with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose hardware store was thriving in the new economic environment. The removal of systematic harassment had created space for Black entrepreneurship and integrated commerce that had transformed the downtown business district.
David, I've got those numbers you asked for, Patterson said, pulling out a notebook filled with carefully documented statistics. In the 6 months since the federal arrests, we've had 12 new minority-owned businesses open in the county. Property values are up, foot traffic is increased, and nobody's getting harassed for shopping where they want.
The economic transformation had been one of the most visible signs of systematic change. When Black families no longer feared harassment from law enforcement, they began participating fully in the local economy. The increased commerce had benefited all businesses while creating the kind of integrated community that had been impossible under Kane's regime. Any signs of organized resistance to the changes? David asked, knowing that some community members resented the federal intervention and might attempt to recreate discriminatory practices through unofficial means. Nothing systematic, Patterson replied. A few grumpy old-timers complaining about change, but no coordinated effort to undermine the reforms. Most people recognize that the new normal is better for everyone. The absence of organized resistance had been encouraging, but not surprising. Kane's network had been built around official authority rather than grassroots support, and removing the corrupt officials had eliminated the infrastructure that had maintained systematic discrimination. At 10 a.m., Agent Sarah Mitchell arrived for her weekly coordination meeting with David. The FBI field office had maintained a permanent presence in Madison County, both to oversee the ongoing reforms and to ensure that David's unique position as undercover agent turned community leader received appropriate federal support. Chief, Agent Mitchell said formally, settling into the back booth where they conducted their regular briefings, I have updates from headquarters about the replication program. The replication program was perhaps the most significant long-term outcome of the Madison County investigation. The Department of Justice had identified David's model, deep undercover investigation, combined with community embedding and post-enforcement relationship building as a template for civil rights enforcement in other jurisdictions. How many other operations are being planned? David asked, understanding that his success had implications far beyond Madison County. 15, Agent Mitchell replied, consulting her classified briefing materials. Rural counties in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, where we've documented similar patterns of systematic civil rights violations. The director wants to replicate your approach, long-term undercover operations that build community trust while gathering evidence. David felt pride in the recognition, but also concern about the complexity of replicating successful undercover community integration. Are the agents being selected receiving adequate training for long-term civilian roles? That's actually why I'm here, Agent Mitchell said. Headquarters wants you to develop and lead the training program. You'd be responsible for preparing agents for deep cover community operations and designing post-investigation relationship management protocols. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of career advancement that David had sacrificed by remaining in Madison County. Leading a national program would restore his upward trajectory within the FBI while allowing him to impact civil rights enforcement throughout the region. What about Common Grounds Coffee? David asked, looking around the space that had become central to his identity and the community's healing process. The Bureau has worked out a partnership arrangement, Agent Mitchell explained. You'd maintain operational control of the coffee shop while leading the training program from a regional headquarters. Best of both worlds, continued community connection and expanded federal impact. David considered the proposal while watching the afternoon customers begin to arrive. High school students grabbing drinks before sports practice, office workers seeking afternoon caffeine, retirees meeting for their daily social interaction. The rhythm of small-town life that had been distorted by systematic oppression was now flowing naturally, creating the kind of integrated community that civil rights enforcement was designed to protect. I'll need time to think about it, David said finally. This community has given me so much, and I want to make sure any decision I make continues serving their interests." "Of course," Agent Mitchell replied. "But I should mention that the proposed training facility would be located here in Madison County. You'd be bringing federal resources and jobs to the community rather than taking expertise away." The proposal was elegant in its recognition that David's effectiveness came from genuine community connection rather than detached federal authority. Establishing a training facility in Madison County would create economic benefits while demonstrating federal commitment to long-term civil rights protection. As the afternoon progressed, David served customers and contemplated the future of his unique career path. The investigation that had begun as a professional assignment had evolved into something much more personal and significant. He had not just documented civil rights violations, he had helped a community heal from systematic trauma while creating a model for federal law enforcement that balanced accountability with relationship building. Mrs. Henderson returned for her afternoon tea, a routine that had become even more precious after the revelation of David's true identity. "David, I've been thinking about your situation," she said with the directness that had made her such an effective witness during the federal trial. "What situation is that, Mrs. Henderson?" "The choice between staying here and advancing your FBI career," she replied. "I know federal headquarters has been pressuring you to take promotions and transfers." David was impressed, but not surprised by her insight. The elderly librarian had demonstrated remarkable understanding of complex situations throughout the investigation and its aftermath. "How do you see the choice?" David asked, genuinely interested in her perspective. "I think you've already made the choice," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "You've created something here that's bigger than any individual career advancement. This coffee shop, the community healing, the model for federal civil rights enforcement. It's your life's work, not just a job assignment." Her words carried the weight of someone who had observed David's transformation from undercover agent to genuine community leader. The investigation had changed him as much as it had changed Madison County, creating bonds that transcended professional obligation. "The question isn't whether to leave," Mrs. Henderson continued. "The question is how to expand what you've built here to help other communities facing similar challenges." David felt the clarity that came from hearing his own thoughts reflected by someone whose judgment he had learned to trust completely. The choice between career advancement and community commitment was false. The real opportunity was to use his unique experience to transform civil rights enforcement on a national scale while maintaining the community relationships that had made his success possible. At closing time, David stood in the coffee shop that had been his cover, his home, and his life's work for nearly 2 years. The space that had been created to document systematic oppression had become a symbol of healing and justice. The community that had been divided by fear had found unity through shared commitment to equality and inclusion. Marcus Kane was beginning his first year of a 25-year federal prison sentence. His network of corrupt officials scattered throughout the federal prison system. The systematic civil rights violations that had defined Madison County for decades had been replaced by comprehensive reforms and ongoing federal oversight. But the real victory was not in the courtroom or the prison sentences. It was in the morning conversations between neighbors who no longer feared each other, the businesses that thrived without harassment, the children who grew up believing that justice was possible when good people found the courage to act. David Washington had traded his coffee shop apron for federal credentials when the investigation concluded, but he had never stopped being both. FBI Civil Rights Division Chief and community coffee shop owner were not separate identities. They were integrated aspects of a life dedicated to the principle that justice required both institutional accountability and personal relationships. The investigation was complete, but the work continued. And in that continuation, David had found his life's purpose.